It was late morning in Chicago, Illinois, sunlight spilling through the living room window and warming the polished wooden floors. I had just set down my cup of tea, enjoying a rare quiet moment before the day's chores began, when the calm was shattered. My daughter-in-law stormed into my home, her face twisted in anger, her voice loud and sharp. I froze, unsure whether to react, to speak, or to retreat. This was my house, my sanctuary, yet she dared to claim it as hers. I knew what I had to do next. If you're watching this video, like, subscribe, and stay till the end to see how I handled her. I was in the kitchen, carefully making my morning coffee, the aroma of roasted beans filling the air, when I heard the front door slam so hard it shook the walls. My hands froze mid-motion, and I turned slowly, expecting maybe a delivery or a neighbor, but it wasn't either. My daughter-in-law stormed in, her face flushed with anger, and she yelled across the room, "Get out of my kitchen!" The sound bounced off the cabinets, rattled the glasses on the shelf, and pierced the quiet I had cherished for so many years. I couldn't breathe for a moment. This was my home, my sanctuary, and here she was, screaming at me as if she owned the place. I took a step back, my mug shaking slightly in my hand, and I watched her stomp toward the counter, slamming the cabinet doors repeatedly, leaving dents and scratches I hadn't noticed before. Each strike sounded like a blow against all the years I had poured into this house. I had spent decades maintaining it, keeping it clean, making it comfortable for everyone. Yet she treated it as though she could do whatever she wanted, whenever she wanted, with no regard for respect or courtesy. I thought of my son, standing silently behind her, and my chest tightened. How could he allow this? How could he watch his wife yell at his own mother? My heart ached with confusion and betrayal. For a moment, I questioned whether I had imagined all the small signs of disrespect I had ignored over the years, or if this was the culmination of everything I had been trying to avoid confronting for so long. Her voice rose again, harsh and commanding, and I realized she had no intention of leaving any room for compromise or conversation. I tried to remain calm, telling myself not to react, not to give her any satisfaction. Every fiber in my body screamed to shout back, to tell her exactly what she was doing, how wrong she was, and how she had no right. But I stayed still, silently counting the breaths in and out, as if grounding myself would prevent me from making a mistake I might regret later. My hands tightened around the coffee mug, and I could feel the warmth of it seeping into my palms, a small comfort against the storm of emotions I felt inside. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier, like the walls themselves were pressing down on me. I remembered the years I had spent raising my son, teaching him right from wrong, showing him the value of respect and family. I thought of every meal I had cooked, every sacrifice I had made, every sleepless night spent worrying over him. And yet, in that moment, it seemed as though all of it meant nothing. He stood there, silent and unmoving, as if he were watching a performance he did not want to interrupt. My mind raced with questions. Was this normal now? Was this the dynamic he wanted in our family? I watched her move around the kitchen, opening drawers and inspecting the counters, as though she were claiming territory that wasn't hers. Her tone was sharp, impatient, full of entitlement, and I could feel the heat of humiliation creeping up my neck. How had it come to this, I wondered? How had I raised a man who would allow such behavior in his own home, in the very place where he had been nurtured, fed, and loved unconditionally? My hands began to tremble slightly, but I refused to let my eyes tear up. I had learned long ago that showing weakness would only embolden people like her. I realized then that this moment, terrifying as it felt, was also an opportunity. I couldn't change what had happened in the past, couldn't undo years of subtle disrespect or moments when my son looked away instead of intervening. But I could control what came next. I could plan, observe, and prepare. I could take back control of my life and my home in a way that didn't rely on shouting, pleading, or appealing to someone else's sense of right and wrong. She finally spun around to leave, thinking she had won some invisible battle. But I remained calm, my mind clearer than it had been in years. I knew the next steps I would take, the quiet but firm actions that would restore respect and reveal the truth behind the facade. That day, in the kitchen that she thought she could dominate, I realized that I had the power, not in my voice, not in my fists, but in the patience and foresight I had cultivated over decades. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one I was about to unleash, silently, with precision. From that moment, I decided to watch, record, and learn everything I could. Every word she spoke, every gesture she made, every subtle lie and act of theft I had long suspected would be documented. I would let her think she had triumphed in that moment, unaware that her actions were only setting the stage for a reckoning that would come quietly but inevitably. I took another sip of coffee, feeling the heat settle into my chest, a reminder that despite the shock and anger, I was still in control of myself and my home. That morning, the kitchen felt charged with tension, but also with clarity. For the first time in years, I felt empowered. I would not be a passive observer any longer. The unexpected visit had shaken me, yes, but it had also awakened a resolve I hadn't realized I still possessed. I would act, and when the time came, the outcome would be undeniable. A quiet, firm, and complete restoration of justice in my own home. I stood there, frozen, as my son, the man I had raised, the one I had poured decades of my life into, started clapping. At first, I thought it was some kind of sarcastic joke, a way of mocking me for my surprise or anger. My chest tightened, my stomach churned, and a wave of disbelief crashed over me. I could hardly breathe. How could he, my own child, applaud the person who had just screamed at his mother in her own kitchen? I wanted to run, to yell, to demand an explanation, but my mind spun, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. As I looked at him, the shock deepened. He was smiling, and not in the way of nervousness or confusion. There was an ease in his expression that I had not expected. His hands moved rhythmically, clapping slowly, deliberately, as though he were enjoying a performance. I felt a mixture of hurt, betrayal, and anger rise in me. All the sacrifices I had made for him, every sleepless night, every meal I had cooked, every tear I had shed silently, seemed to vanish in that moment. He was applauding someone who had disrespected me in my own home. I remembered when he was a boy, and I had clapped for him. His first steps, his first words, his first bicycle ride without training wheels. My applause had always been filled with pride, encouragement, love. But now, seeing him clap for her, it felt like a cruel twist, a reversal of everything I had believed about the bond between a mother and her child. The sound of his hands meeting each other was sharp in the quiet kitchen, like a hammer driving nails into my heart. I wanted to understand why he was doing it. Was it relief? Was it fear? Or had he truly sided with her? I took a careful breath and observed him more closely. His eyes were not cruel. They weren't mocking. They held something else, something I didn't recognize immediately. It was a mixture of tension and resignation, as if he were trying to mask his understanding of a complicated situation. That's when I began to realize that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't clapping out of pride or amusement, but out of a strange, misguided sense of diplomacy. Perhaps he thought that by supporting her in that moment, the storm would pass without further conflict. But what he didn't realize was that his silence and passive applause made me feel invisible, erased, and belittled in my own home. Memories of raising him rushed back in waves. I remembered staying up late at night to help him with homework, working long hours to provide for his education, and sacrificing my own comfort so he could have opportunities I never had. I had done everything for him, hoping he would grow into a man who understood respect and gratitude. But now, standing in my kitchen, watching him applaud someone who had screamed at me, I felt a deep pang of betrayal. How could all those years of love and sacrifice amount to this? I realized then that my son's reaction was also a reflection of his upbringing, not because he didn't care, but because he had been taught to avoid confrontation, to find harmony at any cost. He was a peacemaker by nature, always trying to smooth over conflicts rather than face them head-on. And in that misguided attempt to keep the peace, he had applauded her, thinking it would prevent a bigger argument. But the truth was, his action, or inaction, had hurt me more than any shouting, more than any insult, because it revealed that respect in this household was conditional, and my position, as his mother, had been diminished. I studied his face closely. There was guilt, I could see it now, faint but present. His lips pressed tightly together, his hands still mid-clap, as if frozen by indecision. I understood then that he didn't fully grasp the depth of her audacity, or perhaps he was afraid to confront it. He wanted to maintain the illusion of normalcy, to avoid the tension that would inevitably explode if he spoke. But in doing so, he inadvertently sided with the person who had disrespected me, and in that moment, I felt the full weight of being unseen in my own home. Despite the initial shock, I knew that my son had not yet chosen malice over love. His clapping was not triumph. It was confusion, fear, and perhaps misplaced loyalty, and that gave me hope. It reminded me that, while the situation was painful, it was not beyond repair. I could still restore balance, still show him and her that respect is earned, not assumed, and that no one, not even a family member, had the right to erase me from my own life. In that moment, I decided to remain calm. I would not react impulsively, not with anger or tears. I would observe, record, and plan. Every action she took, every gesture, every word would be noted. I would gather evidence, quietly and patiently, until the time came to expose the truth. My son's clapping, while shocking and painful, had revealed more than I had expected. It had shown me the dynamics in my home, the alliances and blind spots, and the exact steps I would need to take to reclaim what was mine. By the time the morning light spilled into the kitchen, I had made a silent vow. I would not allow my home to be dominated by her, nor would I allow my son's passive behavior to condone her disrespect. The applause had been her moment of victory, but it was temporary. I would use patience, observation, and strategy to turn the tables, quietly but decisively. And when the time came, the truth would shine so brightly that no amount of clapping or charm could hide the damage she had caused. I wanted to speak, to step forward and claim the respect that had been denied to me in my own kitchen, but something held me back. It wasn't fear in the usual sense. It was a mixture of caution, experience, and a growing understanding of the delicate dynamics in my home. Over the years, I had learned that confrontation without strategy often led to chaos, humiliation, and regret. I had faced challenges before, but this situation was different. My daughter-in-law had grown bold, confident in her ability to manipulate situations and people around her. She moved through my home with a sense of entitlement I had never seen before, as if the years of my presence and care were irrelevant. She acted like she owned the place, and in that moment, I realized that any rash response could escalate into something I might regret forever. My son's behavior complicated everything further. Watching him applaud her, I understood that he was not going to intervene. He had always been conflict-averse, avoiding arguments in the hope that harmony could be maintained. But his inaction wasn't harmless. It gave her a green light. Every day I had worked tirelessly to teach him values, responsibility, and respect, yet here he was, applauding someone who had screamed at me in my own home. I could see the tension in his posture, the tightness in his jaw, and the way his eyes flicked nervously between us. It was clear he was caught between loyalty to his wife and respect for me, and in that frozen moment I understood that if I forced a confrontation, I would bear the brunt of the fallout alone. The years of observing her behavior had taught me that she thrived on conflict when it suited her, and she backed down only when faced with undeniable evidence. Her confidence came from knowing that my son would not challenge her, that I, the mother-in-law, was expected to absorb any insult quietly. I had been patient for too long, silently tolerating her disrespect and manipulations, but this moment, her shouting in my kitchen, demanded action. Yet I could not act impulsively. Not when strategy was required. I needed to understand her patterns, to observe her moves, and to gather proof of her intentions before exposing the truth. This wasn't a simple argument over a cabinet or a spilled cup. It was a deeper issue of control, trust, and the preservation of my family's legacy. I thought back to the countless times she had tested boundaries in the house. Small acts at first, moving things without asking, subtly criticizing my cooking, ignoring my presence while entertaining guests. Then the bolder moves, rearranging furniture, claiming spaces as her own, disregarding my opinions, and eventually yelling in the kitchen. Each incident had been a clue, a signal that her behavior was intentional, a way to assert dominance over the household. My son's silent approval, his passive clapping, reinforced her belief that she could act without consequence. If I had intervened immediately during her outburst, it would have seemed emotional and reactive, potentially validating her claims that I was irrational or overbearing. Instead, I chose restraint, observing, calculating, and planning. I also knew that confronting her in that instant could have fractured my relationship with my son. He may have respected me for my wisdom and patience, but his instinct was to protect his spouse even when she was wrong. I had to consider that a direct confrontation could push him further into her camp, causing more damage than good. My silence, though painful, was strategic. It allowed me to see the full picture, to understand not only her intentions, but also the complex dynamics between her and my son. By stepping back, I was not surrendering. I was preparing. I was gathering insight into the ways she maneuvered and the blind spots my son had unwittingly created. During that silent moment, I reflected on the power of observation. For decades, I had relied on action over impulse, learning to navigate the challenges of life with patience and foresight. This situation was no different. I could let anger dictate my response, or I could channel it into a plan that would restore order, respect, and justice in my home. I reminded myself that she thrived on visibility. Drama, shouting, and control in front of others were her tools. By staying silent, I denied her the satisfaction of an immediate reaction, forcing her to act without knowing my intentions. I began to mentally map my next steps. Cameras would be installed. Every transaction, every move, every outburst carefully recorded. I would use the evidence to confront her in a way that could not be disputed, to protect my home and restore respect where it had been lost. I could see it clearly. The confrontation would not be impulsive or fueled by emotion. It would be calculated, precise, and final. I would ensure that my son, despite his passivity, witnessed the truth and understood the lessons hidden beneath my quiet observance. In that moment, I realized something crucial. Restraint was not weakness. Patience was not surrender. By not intervening, I retained control over the situation, ensuring that when the time came, the exposure would be undeniable and the consequences unavoidable. I would let her arrogance guide her, let my son's inaction provide insight into his understanding, and gather all the pieces I needed to reclaim my home. My silence was a tool, my watchful eyes a weapon, and my plan a promise. Finally, I drew a deep breath, steadying myself. I would not shout, I would not react, and I would not allow fear or hurt to cloud my judgment. The day for confrontation would come, and when it did, every act of disrespect, every sneer, every slap of arrogance would be documented and undeniable. The kitchen, my home, and the respect I deserved would be restored. I reminded myself that the calm before the storm was as powerful as the storm itself, and in that quiet, observing, waiting, I regained my strength, preparing to turn a moment of humiliation into a decisive victory for myself, for my home, and for my family. After that day in the kitchen, I realized that observing her behavior alone was not enough. Words, gestures, and moments could be interpreted, misremembered, or dismissed. I needed something concrete, undeniable proof that could tell the story she had tried so hard to hide. That night, I quietly began researching options. Hidden cameras had become accessible and discreet, devices capable of capturing every movement, every conversation, and every intent. I didn't want them to be obvious. She thrived on confrontation and would immediately hide or destroy evidence if she suspected surveillance. What I needed were cameras that could record silently, invisibly, in a way that would capture the truth without alerting her. I mapped out the kitchen first. It had been the battlefield, the room where she had shouted at me and where my son had applauded her audacity. Every corner mattered. The countertops, the cabinet doors, the pantry shelves, even the small nook near the window where I often stood while preparing meals. These cameras had to cover every angle, leaving no space for her to claim ignorance. I researched, bought, and carefully planned their placement over several days, making sure they blended into the environment. A small motion-activated camera above the sink, another tucked subtly behind the fruit basket, and one discreetly near the refrigerator ensured every action would be recorded. I even placed a tiny device by the doorway to catch her entrances and exits. Installing the cameras was a careful process. I didn't want anyone noticing, including my son. I did it in the early morning hours, when the house was quiet and still. My hands shook slightly, but not with fear, with determination. Each screw tightened, each wire hidden behind cabinets was a step toward reclaiming my home and my dignity. I imagined the moment when I would watch the footage, piece together the puzzle of her intentions, and finally confront her with undeniable evidence. This was not about revenge fueled by anger. It was about justice, clarity, and protecting what had been built over decades. I also took measures to ensure that the recordings would be secure. I purchased encrypted storage devices and created backup copies, knowing that she would do everything possible to erase traces if she suspected what I was doing. I labeled every file carefully, noting dates, times, and specific locations in the kitchen where each recording was captured. For the first time, I felt a sense of control over the chaos that had plagued my home. No longer would her actions be dismissed as misunderstandings or mischief. The cameras would tell the story exactly as it happened, with no room for lies or manipulation. In the following days, I observed her from a distance, pretending nothing had changed. She went about her routines, unaware of the eyes silently recording her every move. I noticed subtle patterns I had missed before. The way she handled certain items, the way she glanced around to ensure no one was watching, the small expressions of satisfaction when she thought no one noticed. Every smirk, every hurried movement, every moment of mischief was now being documented, each detail adding weight to the evidence I would eventually present. It was astonishing how much truth she revealed without realizing she was being recorded. I also reflected on my son during this process. His passive behavior had been frustrating and disheartening, but I could see that the cameras would clarify everything for him as well. He would see the truth with his own eyes, unable to dismiss it, unable to defend her actions. My plan wasn't just about exposing her. It was about educating my son, making him understand that respect and honesty must be upheld within our home. He would learn the lessons I had tried to teach him through years of guidance, now reinforced by undeniable proof. Throughout this period, I maintained my routines in the kitchen as if nothing had happened. I cooked, cleaned, and moved through the room with calm normalcy. She continued her behavior, unaware that each gesture, each misplaced item, each raised voice was being recorded. The power of observation through the cameras was transformative. I no longer felt powerless in my own home. I was no longer at the mercy of her whims or my son's inaction. I had finally created a system that would deliver truth in the most undeniable form possible. Every evening, after she had gone to bed, I would review short clips, making notes, storing evidence carefully. I noticed patterns of misbehavior that spanned weeks, sometimes months. Small incidents that seemed insignificant in isolation now formed a clear picture of her intent. She had been undermining my family quietly, subtly, taking advantage of my son's trust and my patience. These recordings would not only reveal her actions, but also demonstrate the calculated nature of her behavior. Nothing could be claimed as accidental. Every act was deliberate and intentional. By the end of the first month, I had compiled enough footage to tell the full story. I watched the clips repeatedly, ensuring I understood each movement, each action and each expression. I wasn't looking for drama or satisfaction. I was preparing for a confrontation that had to be precise, factual, and conclusive. I was ready to reclaim my kitchen, my home, and my dignity, not through shouting or anger, but through undeniable truth. In those quiet moments, I realized the power of patience, observation, and preparation. The kitchen, once a place of humiliation, would become the stage where the truth was revealed, where justice was served, and where respect was restored. I had turned my anger into strategy, my frustration into foresight, and my patience into a tool that would finally expose her without ambiguity. For the first time in months, I felt calm, knowing that every move, every act, every insult would be documented, stored, and ready to confront her in a way that could not be ignored or denied. A week after the cameras had quietly settled into the corners of my kitchen, I finally found a moment to watch the recordings. I did it when the house was silent, the sun barely spilling into the kitchen, and I had my tea beside me. I didn't rush. I knew the evidence would speak for itself, and I needed to be ready for everything it would reveal. My heart was steady, my mind clear. This was not about emotion. It was about uncovering the truth and understanding the depth of her actions. I wanted to see exactly what had been happening in my home, in the space I had built and maintained for decades, and finally, I was about to witness it. The first few clips were mundane, her entering the kitchen, moving around casually, cleaning or preparing a meal. At first, nothing seemed alarming. I reminded myself to stay objective, not to let the hurt I had carried for months cloud my judgment. Then, I noticed the small inconsistencies. She would open drawers and cupboards that weren't hers to open, linger too long over certain cabinets, and glance quickly around as if checking for witnesses. Her hands fumbled with things that didn't belong to her, and she smiled in a way that made me uneasy. The more I watched, the clearer the pattern became. She was looking for opportunities, exploiting the space I had allowed her, and taking liberties that were not hers to take. Then came the first undeniable moment. I saw her handle a small, ornate box that belonged to my late husband. It had always been locked in the top drawer of the cabinet, a place I trusted she would never think to reach. But reach she did. She lifted the box, opened it, and quickly rifled through its contents. Old coins, jewelry, and a few letters that were priceless to me. She didn't stop there. She carefully placed some of the jewelry into a small bag she had hidden in her apron pocket. The precision, the deliberate care with which she acted revealed her intentions. This wasn't carelessness or curiosity. It was theft. Cold and calculated, done without a shred of conscience. My hands shook slightly as I continued watching. Every clip confirmed what I had feared. She had been taking small valuables for weeks, maybe months, selling them quietly online or hiding them away. There was no indication of remorse, no hesitation, no care for the sanctity of our home. My son had witnessed some of this, I realized with a sinking feeling, explaining why he had clapped that day in the kitchen. Relief, perhaps, that she hadn't been caught yet. The footage left no room for doubt. Every object, every gesture, every transaction was visible, undeniable, and recorded. I paused the video, taking a deep breath. I documented everything meticulously. Each clip was labeled with the date, time, and description of what had occurred. I noted the items she had touched, the bags she carried, and the subtle signals she gave herself to remember where she had hidden things. I watched her repeatedly, making sure I didn't miss a single detail. By the end of that evening, I had a full timeline of her movements, her actions, and the small betrayals she had woven into the very fabric of our daily life. I also discovered something more disturbing. She had been selling some of the items online, using accounts I had never seen, and arranging for pickup or delivery while claiming she was elsewhere. The camera had captured moments when she stepped out briefly, carrying items I recognized from the kitchen. It was all methodical. The same hands that had shouted at me, the same woman who had acted as if she owned the house, had been quietly dismantling it piece by piece, treating our home as if it were her own private warehouse. The realization was both shocking and empowering. I had proof, and that proof would not lie. The more I watched, the more I saw how deliberate her behavior had been. She had rehearsed her excuses, timed her departures, and even staged her appearances in front of my son to avoid suspicion. Every moment of audacity, every attempt to appear innocent, had been captured without her knowledge. I realized I had not been powerless. I had merely lacked evidence. Now, with the recordings in hand, I could finally level the playing field. Justice would not be shouted or demanded. It would be demonstrated through truth, through the undeniable proof of her actions. By the end of that week, I had compiled dozens of clips, each carefully preserved, each telling a part of the story. The kitchen, once a place of chaos and humiliation, had now become a vault of truth. I could see everything clearly. The thefts, the lies, the manipulation, and the disrespect. And most importantly, I could see how my son had been complicit through silence. His applause that day in the kitchen was no longer confusing. It was part of the story I now fully understood. He had known, and he had done nothing to stop it, perhaps hoping it would resolve itself, perhaps trusting her too much. I stored all the evidence securely, backing it up in multiple places. I wrote notes, timestamps, and summaries. This was no longer about revenge alone. It was about accountability. She had undermined my authority, disrespected my space, and abused my trust. The recordings ensured that there would be no room for argument, no chance for denial. When the day came to confront her, I would have all the power of truth behind me. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of control. I knew the next steps would be decisive, precise, and final. I realized then that the act of observing had transformed me. Watching her without her knowledge gave me clarity, focus, and a plan. I no longer felt fearful or uncertain in my own home. The cameras had not just captured her actions, they had captured the path to reclaiming my dignity, my kitchen, and my family's respect. The evidence was now mine, undeniable and complete, and soon she would see that the same home she had tried to dominate was now a stage where the truth would finally be revealed. Once I had collected all the evidence from the cameras, organized every clip, and noted every instance of theft or deception, I began planning the confrontation carefully. This wasn't a moment for anger or impulsiveness. It had to be precise, controlled, and final. I knew my daughter-in-law well enough to anticipate her reactions, the excuses, the fake tears, the bluster. I also understood my son's character. He was conflicted, often silent when he should act. I needed to make sure that the truth would be undeniable, that it would be seen and heard by everyone involved. Planning was not just about justice. It was about reclaiming my authority in my own home and setting boundaries that had been long ignored. I called my lawyer, a longtime family friend who had handled our estate matters for decades. I explained everything calmly, systematically. I didn't need to exaggerate or plead. I simply presented the evidence, described her actions, and laid out the timeline I had carefully documented. The lawyer listened quietly, occasionally nodding, and offered advice on the best approach. He recommended confronting her with the proof while ensuring that my son was present, not to shame him, but to make him fully aware of his own complicity through inaction. I agreed. This confrontation was going to be thorough, deliberate, and unforgettable. Next, I chose the moment. I waited until she would least expect it, during a mid-morning tea that I suggested casually. She arrived dressed as if the day were ordinary, unaware that I had already prepared the living room for a quiet, controlled encounter. My son was present, sitting quietly, and I made sure the atmosphere was calm, almost domestic, so that her attention would be on me and the evidence, not on any imagined confrontation or drama. I wanted her to see the reality of her actions clearly, without distraction, without an audience to sympathize with her. The focus had to remain on her behavior and the undeniable proof that had been quietly accumulating over weeks. I placed the documents, the lists, and the clips on the table in front of her without a word. She looked at me curiously, perhaps suspicious, perhaps sensing a slight shift in my demeanor. Then I calmly started showing her each piece of evidence. First the minor incidents, the small items she had moved or taken without permission, then the larger instances of theft, including the online sales I had tracked meticulously. I pointed out the exact dates and times, the specific actions she had performed, and how my son had witnessed some of these moments without intervening. I did not shout, I did not weep, I did not plead, I simply presented the facts. Her reaction was immediate and telling. She stammered, her eyes widening as she realized the extent of what I had documented. The confident, brash attitude she often carried had vanished. The voice that had shouted at me in my own kitchen had reduced to whispers, and the sharp glances and haughty posture were replaced by hesitation and fear. She tried to explain, to justify, to deflect, but each excuse crumbled under the weight of the proof laid before her. Every video, every receipt, every time-stamped clip was a silent witness to her actions, and there was nothing she could say to counter it. I watched her closely as I methodically went through each instance, making sure she understood the significance. The stolen items were not just objects. They represented years of trust, memories, and the sanctity of our family home. The online sales were not just transactions, they were betrayals, exploiting the very foundation I had built with care, patience, and love. My son, for the first time, seemed to fully grasp the depth of the situation. His previous amusement, his passive applause during her outburst in the kitchen, was replaced by visible discomfort, recognition, and perhaps shame. By the end of the session, she was pale, trembling, and speechless. She had no more excuses, no more lies. The confrontation was complete, and the balance of power had shifted back to where it belonged, with the person she had tried to undermine. My son sat quietly, processing everything, witnessing how integrity and diligence could reveal truth and reclaim respect. He realized, perhaps too late, the consequences of his passive complicity and the importance of standing up for justice, even within his own family. This confrontation was not about revenge for anger's sake. It was a demonstration of authority, evidence, and meticulous planning. I had ensured that no emotion could cloud the clarity of the truth. By staying calm, presenting undeniable proof, and controlling the environment, I had achieved what I needed: the exposure of betrayal, the reclamation of my home, and the awakening of my son to the consequences of passivity. In the quiet that followed, as she stared at the evidence, the reality of her actions sank in. She could no longer maintain control, confidence, or pretense. When the session ended, I knew that I had accomplished what years of subtle humiliation and disrespect had failed to teach her. The kitchen, my home, and my authority had been restored, not through anger or force, but through preparation, patience, and undeniable proof. The quiet victory felt profound, a combination of justice and self-respect. She had finally faced the consequences of her choices, and my son had witnessed the necessity of honesty and accountability. From that day on, the house was mine again, not just physically, but morally and emotionally. The day of exposure was unlike any day I had experienced in years. I made sure everything was in place, from the documents neatly arranged on the dining table to my son quietly observing, aware of the gravity of the situation. I had sent her a casual invitation for tea, knowing she would show up without suspicion, confident in her usual bravado. She arrived, expecting a simple gathering, completely unaware that this would be the moment where every lie she had told, every theft she had committed, and every act of disrespect she had shown would be revealed in stark, undeniable clarity. The atmosphere in the room was calm, deceptively so, but I could feel the tension building as the confrontation began. I started with the smaller, almost insignificant items she had taken over the months: the tiny heirlooms, the antique spoons, the silver candlesticks, all carefully documented with photographs, receipts, and timestamps. I explained each one, detailing how it had disappeared, where she had moved it, and how I had discovered the irregularities. Her reaction was subtle at first, a nervous flicker in her eyes, a slight tightening of her lips. She tried to smile, tried to make light of the situation, but her discomfort was palpable. Every denial she attempted collapsed against the factual evidence I presented. She could not refute the photographs or the timestamps. They were indisputable. As I progressed to the larger issues, her confidence began to crumble further. I laid out the online sales she had conducted without permission, complete with screenshots of the listings, messages to buyers, and the accounts where the money had been transferred. I pointed out the dates, many coinciding with significant family events, moments when she should have been present, but was instead profiting from the household she had claimed to care for. My son, sitting silently beside me, watched her shrink in stature, the once dominant and intimidating presence now reduced to a fragile figure weighed down by guilt and fear. I made sure to highlight not just the theft, but the emotional betrayal as well. She had shouted at me in my own kitchen, treated the house as if it were hers, and humiliated me in front of friends and neighbors. I walked her through the hidden camera footage, moments captured over weeks, her anger, her frustration, her smug amusement when she thought no one was watching. I showed her the clips where she had mocked my routines, belittled my knowledge of family affairs, and flaunted her disregard for the home we had built. Each clip was accompanied by a concise explanation, leaving no room for misinterpretation or deflection. Her face had turned pale by the time I reached the crucial part, the financial records. I had meticulously documented the missing funds from the accounts she had managed, showing how she had transferred money to her own accounts and concealed transactions with forged receipts. She gasped softly, covering her mouth with her hands, her body trembling. My son's expression shifted from mild disbelief to horror as he realized how much had gone unnoticed, how deeply he had underestimated the damage she had done. There was no clapping this time, no amused applause, only the stark reality settling in the room. I maintained calm, speaking in clear, deliberate sentences. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't let anger dictate my actions. The strength lay in the evidence, in the careful preparation, and in the undeniable truth. Every photo, every video, every document was a piece of the puzzle she had tried to hide. She couldn't interrupt, she couldn't evade, and she certainly couldn't defend herself. Each point I made was calculated, designed to leave her with no escape and no justification. I wanted her to see the magnitude of her actions, to fully understand that respect is earned, not demanded, and betrayal always has consequences. By the end of the presentation, she was visibly broken. Her posture slumped, her eyes avoided mine, and her usual arrogance had disappeared entirely. I watched as the reality of her actions weighed down on her. The exposure was complete. My son sat silently, now fully aware of what had transpired under his own roof, under his own watch. He had witnessed the full scope of her deceit, and the lesson he received that day would not be forgotten. It was not just about punishment, it was about accountability, about teaching the importance of honesty, trust, and respect within a family. I concluded the session by calmly stating the next steps. The lawyer had prepared legal documents to recover the stolen items, to rectify the financial damages, and to establish clear boundaries moving forward. I reminded her that the house, my kitchen, and my role in the family would no longer be subject to her whims. She nodded silently, her face pale and her voice gone, understanding fully that the days of manipulation, disrespect, and hidden theft had ended. As she left the house, no longer smiling or confident, I felt a quiet sense of triumph. Not a triumph born from anger, but from meticulous planning, careful observation, and unwavering resolve. My home was restored, my authority reaffirmed, and my son finally recognized the importance of standing for truth and justice, even when it is uncomfortable. That day marked the end of her control, the end of her disrespect, and the beginning of a renewed order in our family. The exposure was complete, the consequences undeniable, and the lessons permanent. After the day of exposure, the social fallout was swift and absolute. Word traveled quickly through the neighborhood, through family friends, and even through casual acquaintances who had only ever known her as the polished, confident daughter-in-law. I began to hear whispers the next morning as I stepped outside to fetch the newspaper. People were talking about her, about the stolen heirlooms, the financial manipulation, and the disrespect she had shown in my own home. Neighbors I had barely exchanged words with approached me cautiously, offering quiet support and words of validation. It was a strange mix of relief and astonishment on their faces, as though they had suspected something but had never known the full extent until now. Her attempts to defend herself publicly only made matters worse. She reached out to friends, posting carefully worded apologies and explanations, but the evidence had already spoken louder than any words she could muster. Screenshots of the sales, photographs of the missing items, and clips from the hidden camera footage had circulated quietly among family circles and friends. Each attempt at damage control crumbled instantly because there was no way to argue against proof. People who had admired her sophistication, her charm, and her seemingly confident presence were now forced to see the truth. The facade she had cultivated for years had dissolved completely, leaving behind a hollow, vulnerable figure stripped of credibility. The gossip wasn't malicious, it was just the natural consequence of transparency. Everyone I spoke to, neighbors, family friends, even casual acquaintances, wanted to understand what had happened, and I explained as clearly and calmly as possible. I focused not on shaming her, but on making the truth undeniable. I laid out the sequence of events, the hidden camera footage, and the financial evidence for those who asked. I showed them the photos of the stolen heirlooms, the receipts from online sales, and the transaction histories that proved she had been taking advantage of the family for months. Each person I spoke to nodded quietly, some in disbelief, others in sympathy, but all in agreement that justice had been served. Her social image collapsed almost immediately. People who had once invited her to gatherings, dinners, and social events quietly rescinded invitations. Those who had once treated her with respect now kept a careful distance. She became a cautionary tale in the neighborhood, a reminder of what happens when deceit and disrespect go unchecked. Even minor acquaintances who had no direct involvement in our family matters began whispering about her. Her reputation, painstakingly built over years, vanished in the span of a single week. Each new story that surfaced about her past actions, times when she had lied, cheated, or manipulated others, only reinforced the lessons that had been laid bare in our home. My son, who had witnessed the full scope of her deceit, finally began to understand the depth of the problem. At first, he had seemed hesitant, caught between loyalty to his wife and recognition of the truth. But as the social fallout grew, he could no longer ignore it. He saw how friends, neighbors, and even distant relatives reacted to the evidence. He watched their reactions, noting the disbelief, the shock, and ultimately, the respect for the way I had handled the situation. It became a lesson for him as well, that family integrity and honesty must come before blind loyalty, and that those who betray trust cannot be allowed to remain unchallenged. She herself seemed to shrink with each passing day. Attempts to regain control failed spectacularly. Social media became a minefield where people questioned her every move. Comments referencing the scandal popped up everywhere, from casual posts to birthday messages, and she could do nothing to silence them. Her friends, embarrassed by their association with her, began pulling away. Invitations she once received to events were suddenly rescinded, sometimes quietly, sometimes bluntly. Her pride, once so robust, now seemed fragile and brittle, cracked by the undeniable weight of truth. I found it strange at first how quickly the world responded once deception was revealed. People who had never spoken to me before now offered their respect and support. Neighbors who had once doubted my authority in my own kitchen now nodded knowingly, sometimes with a quiet word of congratulations. I realized then that the fallout was not just about her punishment. It was also a restoration of order, a correction of social perception. Truth, when presented calmly and clearly, commands respect, and lies, no matter how long hidden, eventually unravel. By the end of the week, the social atmosphere around our home had completely shifted. My kitchen, once the scene of chaos and disrespect, became a symbol of regained control. Friends and neighbors visited without hesitation, acknowledging both my calm handling of the situation and the evidence that had supported my actions. The daughter-in-law, on the other hand, became increasingly isolated. She avoided public spaces, stopped posting on social media, and even withdrew from family gatherings, too embarrassed to face anyone. Her social network had contracted to almost nothing, leaving her alone to deal with the consequences of her actions. Through all of this, I maintained my composure. I didn't gloat, I didn't shame unnecessarily, and I didn't rub her mistakes in her face. My approach was quiet, deliberate, and methodical, showing the power of evidence, calm reasoning, and patience. By exposing the truth and letting the social fallout take its natural course, I ensured that justice was not only served but also witnessed by all those who mattered. People saw her deception, understood the consequences, and respected the way I handled it. The social fallout, though harsh for her, was necessary. It restored balance in my family and in our community. It taught my son the value of discernment, patience, and standing firm in the face of betrayal. And it reminded everyone around that deceit and disrespect, no matter how cleverly hidden, always come to light. By the end, I had not only reclaimed my home and authority, but had also reaffirmed my place in the social fabric, respected, trusted, and finally at peace with the world around me. After the social fallout had settled, I turned my attention back to the kitchen, the heart of my home and the place where the conflict had begun. For years, that kitchen had been a symbol of warmth, family, and comfort. The place where I had prepared countless meals, celebrated birthdays, and offered quiet counsel over cups of tea. But now, after the chaos with my daughter-in-law, it had felt like a battlefield. Each cabinet door I opened, each countertop I cleaned, reminded me of the disrespect and deceit that had invaded my sanctuary. I knew that restoring the kitchen would not just be about cleanliness or order. It would be about reclaiming the space, reasserting my authority, and reestablishing the sense of peace that had once been so natural there. I began with a thorough inspection. Every shelf, every drawer, every utensil was examined carefully. I removed items that no longer belonged, gifts that had been misused or neglected, appliances that had been tampered with, and dishes that carried traces of chaos. Each object I handled was a small act of reclamation, a statement that this was my home and my rules. As I worked, I felt a sense of empowerment growing inside me. The act of physically restoring order mirrored the internal restoration I was experiencing. The anger, confusion, and humiliation of that day gradually gave way to a quiet, steadfast determination to take back what was rightfully mine. Next, I reorganized everything meticulously. Pots and pans were placed according to size and frequency of use, spices arranged by aroma and flavor, and utensils stored for maximum efficiency. I labeled some containers and created designated spots for items that had often been left in disorder by my daughter-in-law. The process was slow and deliberate, but with every step, I felt a growing sense of control and clarity. The kitchen began to feel alive again, no longer a place of tension and fear, but a space of competence and calm. Even the smallest details, a polished countertop, a neatly arranged spice rack, contributed to the feeling that I had regained mastery over my environment. I also made subtle changes that would ensure the future security of the space. Locks were installed on certain cabinets where family heirlooms and important documents were kept. The pantry was reorganized to track inventory, ensuring that nothing could be taken or misused again. I even repositioned the chairs around the table, not for formality, but to subtly remind the family that respect and order were now the rules, not mere suggestions. These changes were practical and strategic, but they also carried a symbolic weight. They were a message to anyone who had previously disrespected the space that boundaries were now firmly established, and that deceit or chaos would no longer be tolerated in my home. As I worked, my son began to notice the transformation. He had been silent during the scandal, absorbing the lessons from the exposure, the social fallout, and the quiet strength I had demonstrated. Now, seeing the kitchen restored, he began to understand the depth of my resilience and the importance of respecting both the home and the people within it. He offered help occasionally, but but I guided him rather than directed him, showing through action how to care for the space properly. The kitchen, once a point of conflict, became a place of quiet teaching. My son slowly began to internalize the values of order, respect, and responsibility, lessons he had neglected to grasp when his wife had disrespected me. Once the physical restoration was complete, I focused on the intangible aspects, the atmosphere of the kitchen. I introduced small rituals to bring warmth and comfort back into the space. Morning coffee was no longer rushed or tense. It became a deliberate act of reflection and peace. Afternoon snacks were shared quietly, without distraction, allowing time to savor both the food and the reclaimed sense of calm. Evenings were dedicated to simple routines, preparing dinner with care, setting the table thoughtfully, and ensuring that every action reinforced the respect and harmony I now demanded in my home. Slowly, the kitchen returned not just to its former function, but to its rightful role as the emotional heart of the house. The change was noticeable not only to me, but to the rest of the family. Neighbors who visited commented on the sense of order and warmth that seemed to radiate from the kitchen. The daughter-in-law, who had once dominated the space with loud commands and disrespect, avoided it entirely, her presence now replaced by quiet acknowledgement of boundaries she could no longer challenge. The contrast was stark. Where chaos and humiliation had once reigned, now there was calm, structure, and a clear sense of authority. My son, too, began to respect the rules without coercion, understanding through observation the importance of order and respect within a family home. Over time, the kitchen became more than just a restored space. It became a symbol of my resilience and authority. Each meal prepared, each cabinet opened, and each cup of tea poured was a quiet assertion that my home, my rules, and my dignity were intact. The process of restoration allowed me to reclaim my sense of self, my pride, and my quiet joy in nurturing the family through daily acts of care. The memory of that humiliating day faded, replaced by a steady, enduring sense of empowerment and control. By the time I finished, the kitchen was fully restored, both physically and symbolically. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, the surfaces gleamed, and everything was in its rightful place. More importantly, the balance within the home was reestablished. I could walk into the kitchen now without a trace of fear, hesitation, or resentment. Instead, there was confidence, calm, and a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing I had reclaimed not just a room, but my authority, my dignity, and the respect of my family. The restoration of the kitchen marked a turning point. It was no longer a place of confrontation. It was a place of quiet triumph. Each morning as I stood there, preparing breakfast or making coffee, I felt the weight of the past lift slightly. The daughter-in-law's shadow no longer darkened the space. The lessons had been learned, the chaos had ended, and the heart of my home had returned to its rightful state, peaceful, orderly, and under my control, a silent testament to the power of patience, vigilance, and resolve. Every morning now begins differently. I wake up knowing that the kitchen, once a battlefield of disrespect and chaos, is calm, orderly, and mine. I take my time preparing my coffee, measuring each scoop of grounds, filling the kettle, and letting the aroma fill the house. The quiet is a comfort I never thought I would feel again. The daughter-in-law, once so loud and commanding, no longer storms in, no longer shouts or mocks. Her presence has been replaced by silence, a silence that speaks louder than words ever could. Each moment I spend in the kitchen now reinforces the knowledge that I have reclaimed my home, my dignity, and my authority, all without raising my voice or causing public conflict. The calmness in the air is a quiet applause to my patience, strategy, and endurance over years of subtle humiliation. I watch my son carefully. He has changed, though not overnight. He observes the restored order and begins to understand what respect and responsibility truly mean. There is no need for lectures. He sees it in my actions. He watches how I handle every cup, every dish, every pan with care and attention. and he realizes the depth of what had been taken from me and the strength it required to reclaim it. Sometimes he helps me rearrange items or fold towels, and I allow him the space to act, guiding him gently. It is not just about restoring the kitchen, it is about restoring the balance in the family, about teaching through example what had long been ignored or dismissed. The daughter-in-law has withdrawn completely, neighbors have noticed her absence, and even family friends whisper about the change. Where she once held power through intimidation and loud commands, now she is powerless in her own perception. I do not gloat, but I do observe the quiet justice of it all. Her attempts to assert control have been erased, not with anger, but with calm, deliberate actions. The evidence I presented to the lawyer, the exposure, and the clear re-establishment of boundaries have left her without leverage. The lesson has been learned without a confrontation, screaming through the walls, but rather through methodical planning, patience, and unwavering resolve. I take pleasure in small rituals that reinforce my sense of victory. Morning coffee is sacred. Afternoon tea is a time for reflection. Each meal prepared in the kitchen is a demonstration of care, love, and regained authority. The tools and utensils I use, arranged just so, represent both the practical and symbolic restoration of my home. Every polished countertop, every neatly stacked dish, and every labeled container reminds me that order is not only a physical state, but a reflection of inner control and dignity. The kitchen has become my sanctuary once more, a place where I can think clearly, act deliberately, and take pride in the space I built and reclaimed. Even my granddaughter has begun to notice the difference. She sits quietly at the kitchen table, coloring or reading while I prepare meals, and she senses the change in atmosphere. There is calm instead of chaos, warmth instead of tension. She can enjoy her grandmother's kitchen without fear or confusion, without witnessing disrespect or humiliation. I think of her often when I am here, because part of the victory is not just reclaiming the space for myself, but also preserving it for the next generation. I want her to know that a home is a place of respect, love, and order, not a stage for manipulation or deceit. I have also reinstated simple rules that protect the household. Each family member now understands boundaries in subtle, unspoken ways. The daughter-in-law's absence is a reminder, her silence a warning. I do not need to enforce my authority loudly. The quiet presence of order and respect speaks for itself. I have learned that power is most effective when it is exercised calmly and consistently. The lessons of that day when she screamed in my kitchen and my son applauded have been transformed into a lasting structure of respect. I now hold authority not through confrontation, but through deliberate restoration and maintained order. There are times when I pause in the kitchen, holding a cup of tea and reflecting on the journey. The humiliation, the fear, the chaos, all of it is behind me now. I can see how much strength it took to endure those moments without losing my sense of self. I see how each calculated step, each quiet action led to a long-lasting resolution. I smile softly, knowing that I have not only reclaimed my kitchen, but also my peace of mind. The daughter-in-law, once a threat to my dignity, now exists only as a reminder of the consequences of disrespect and deceit. The silence in the kitchen is more powerful than her loudest shout ever was. The quiet victory also reminds me of my own resilience. Age has not diminished my ability to act decisively or to protect what is mine. I am older, yes, but wiser, stronger, and unshakable in the face of challenges that once seemed insurmountable. The kitchen is no longer just a room. It is a testament to patience, strategy, and calm persistence. Each day I spend here reinforces the lesson that respect cannot be demanded through fear or shouting. It must be earned and maintained through consistent action and a steadfast presence. Now, as I prepare breakfast or set the table, I feel a sense of completeness that had been missing for years. The daughter-in-law avoids the house, my son has learned the importance of respect, and the home has returned to its natural state, warm, welcoming, and orderly. I take quiet satisfaction in knowing that the victory was mine, not through spectacle or confrontation, but through deliberate, thoughtful action. The kitchen, restored and peaceful, is a symbol of my triumph, resilience, and the enduring power of calm authority. The final triumph is not loud or dramatic, but steady and lasting. I sip my coffee each morning, enjoying the aroma, the warmth, and the knowledge that the heart of my home is secure once more. Silence now fills the space, a quiet applause for the years of patience, strategy, and unwavering resolve. The daughter-in-law's absence is a subtle reminder, and the restored kitchen stands as proof that dignity, respect, and authority can be reclaimed through careful, deliberate action. I have won quietly, fully, and forever.